We all think we know what a ninja is: silent assassin, black clothes, superhuman skills. But what if everything you imagine is a lie? Before we dive into the myth versus reality, here's the dark truth Japan never told the world. The myth versus the reality. When most people hear the word ninja, they instantly picture a black-clad assassin flipping across rooftops like a Marvel hero. Silent, deadly, practically invisible. It's a cool image. But it's also one of the biggest myths Japan ever exported to the world. Because the real ninjas, they were nothing like that. The truth is far more uncomfortable and honestly far more interesting. Ninjas weren't superhumans or magic warriors. They were ordinary men and women pushed into extraordinary situations. They were spies, saboteurs, scouts, information brokers, and political tools used by powerful lords who wanted results without staining their honor. And that's the part people forget. Japan's samurai society was obsessed with honor. There were rules for everything: how to fight, how to speak, even how to die. Using deception or trickery was considered disgraceful. A samurai couldn't sneak into an enemy camp at night or poison food without destroying his reputation. But if you needed someone to do those things, you quietly hired a ninja. That's what makes them forbidden. They existed in a moral gray zone, needed but never acknowledged, skilled but never celebrated. Every lord wanted to win battles, gather secrets, and eliminate threats. But no one wanted to admit they relied on people who operated outside the rules. So ninjas became shadows, not because they were supernatural, but because society forced them into the dark. If anything, the real ninja story isn't about superpowers. It's about survival, secrecy, and the uncomfortable truth that even the most honorable cultures need someone willing to do the things others won't. Born in the shadows, Iga and Kōga. If the ninja world had a true origin story, it wouldn't begin in a shiny palace or a heroic battlefield. It would start in the misty mountains of Iga and Kōga, two isolated regions tucked deep inside Japan, far from the luxury and politics of Kyoto. These weren't glamorous places. They were rural, rugged, and constantly threatened by larger warlords who wanted control. And because no samurai clan truly protected them, the people there had to protect themselves. That's how ninja culture was born, not from magic scrolls, but from survival. Families formed alliances called Iki, or self-governed village militias. They trained in guerrilla tactics, scouting, night attacks, escape routes, and sabotage. These techniques weren't seen as dishonorable in Iga or Kōga. They were necessary. When you're a farmer facing an army, you can't rely on honor. You rely on whatever works. One of the most famous examples of their power came in 1581, when Oda Nobunaga, one of Japan's most ruthless warlords, sent tens of thousands of troops to crush Iga. You'd think a tiny mountain province would fall instantly. Didn't. A few hundred ninja fighters slowed down Nobunaga's army with traps, hidden pits, sudden ambushes, nighttime raids, and psychological tricks. The resistance was so fierce that historians still refer to it as the Tensho Iga War, a moment that proved how dangerous untrained villagers could be when fighting on their own terms. The people of Iga and Kōga didn't choose to become ninjas. Circumstances forced them to, and from that pressure an entire shadow tradition was born, one that Japan would rely on for centuries. Disguises, deception, and dirty tactics. Forget the idea of ninjas running around in tight black outfits. Historically, that would have been the fastest way to get caught. Real ninjas blended into crowds so well that you could sit next to one at a tea house and never suspect a thing. Their greatest weapon wasn't a sword, it was invisibility in plain sight. A ninja might dress as a merchant carrying rice, or a wandering monk asking for donations, or a woodcutter moving through forests without being questioned. They studied the behavior, speech, and habits of these roles until they could live inside them. And that's why they were so feared. You never knew who they were or when they were watching. But disguises were just the beginning. Ninjas mastered tactics the samurai considered dirty. They used misdirection, psychological tricks, and small acts of sabotage that caused huge political consequences. Sometimes a ninja didn't need to kill a target. They only needed to misplace a letter, move a border marker, or start the right rumor at the right time. Their tools were equally clever. They crafted hollow reeds to breathe underwater. They carried tiny bombs to distract guards. They used powders that blurred vision, ropes hidden in sleeves, and darts disguised as hairpins. Not magical, just smart engineering for survival. The darkest part? Many ninja missions had nothing to do with violence. They were designed to break confidence, sow fear, or make an enemy doubt his own allies. And sometimes that was more devastating than any blade could ever be. Real ninjas didn't fight fair, because fighting fair meant dying. Ninjas were criminals? Here's the part most people don't want to hear. In their own time, ninjas were not admired warriors. They weren't seen as symbols of courage or discipline. To the authorities, they were officially labeled as rule breakers, law violators, and sometimes even bandits. The word shinobi itself can be read as one who sneaks or one who steals in. That tells you everything about how society viewed them. Japan's samurai code, the Bushido, worshipped honor, open combat, loyalty, bravery, and facing your enemy directly. Ninjas did the opposite. They infiltrated, deceived, impersonated, manipulated, and struck when no one was looking. Useful skills, yes, but deeply uncomfortable in a culture built on pride. This created a bizarre contradiction. Publicly, no lord would ever admit to hiring a ninja. Doing so would make him look weak or dishonorable. Privately, however, every powerful clan kept ninjas on their payroll. They needed spies, scouts, and saboteurs, but they also needed to keep their hands clean. Ninjas became the perfect solution. They did the dirty work and someone else got the credit. But the moment something went wrong, a fire, a missing document, a failed negotiation, who was the first to be blamed? The ninja. Their image made them the ideal scapegoat. They were everywhere, yet nowhere. Essential, yet disposable. That's why ninjas lived in the shadows. Not because they wanted to, but because society forced them there. Their skills were valuable, but their existence embarrassed the same people who relied on them. In a land obsessed with honor, ninjas became the necessary criminals, the people who broke the rules so others could pretend to follow them. When ninjas worked for the government. Here's the twist no one expects. The same society that called ninjas criminals eventually hired them as government employees. Yes, the shadowy spies who once operated outside the law suddenly became part of the law. This shift began during the Tokugawa shogunate, a period when Japan finally unified after centuries of war. With peace came a new priority: controlling information. The shogun needed people who understood stealth, intelligence, surveillance, and infiltration better than anyone else. And there was only one group with that skill set, the ninja families of Iga and Kōga. So instead of hunting them, the government absorbed them. Ninjas were assigned roles that sound surprisingly modern. Intelligence officers, undercover inspectors, security advisors, castle guards, investigators disguised as normal citizens. Some even worked inside Edo Castle, the political heart of the country. They monitored suspicious samurai, intercepted messages, and quietly prevented internal plots before they erupted. The most famous example is Hattori Hanzo, a real ninja who protected Tokugawa Ieyasu during the chaos of war. Hollywood turns him into a kung fu legend, but historically, he was more like Japan's first intelligence chief: calm, strategic, loyal, and terrifyingly efficient. His descendants even guarded the shogun's gates for generations. But here's the dark irony. After the shogunate hired its own ninjas, it didn't want anyone else using them. Stealth arts became regulated, then restricted, then quietly suppressed. The government wanted the shadows to work for them, not against them. So ninjutsu transformed from a survival tradition into a forbidden, state-controlled skill set. The shadows didn't disappear, they were simply nationalized. The death and rebirth of ninjas. By the mid-1800s, real ninjas were fading into history. Japan had entered a long era of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. And when peace lasts long enough, shadow warriors become unnecessary. Guns were becoming common. Castles were less important. Surveillance networks were formalized. The world simply didn't need barefoot saboteurs sneaking through valleys at night. But the strangest thing happened. Just as ninjas disappeared in real life, they were reborn in people's imaginations. The first place this happened was in kabuki theater. Playwrights took faint whispers of old ninja legends and turned them into dramatic stage characters. Suddenly ninjas could appear and vanish, walk through walls or cast illusions, all thanks to stage tricks, wires, and smoke. Audiences loved it. Real ninjas never had these abilities, but the fantasy stuck. Then came the writers. Novelists during the Edo and Meiji periods exaggerated ninja skills even further, turning them into superhuman fighters who could charm snakes, tame shadows, or sprint across water. None of it was real, but it was entertaining. And that was enough. By the 20th century, ninjas had transformed again, this time through films, comics, movies, and eventually anime. Hollywood turned them into unstoppable assassins. Japan turned them into mystical warriors. Modern pop culture gave them supernatural powers, secret clans, and ancient prophecies. The truth was long gone, replaced by something louder, brighter, and far easier to sell. But the real story, that's darker and more honest. Ninjas survived not because of magic, but because of discipline, patience, psychology, and a willingness to do what others couldn't. Japan didn't erase the ninja. It just replaced them with a legend the world was more comfortable believing. The forbidden truth behind the ninja legend. So after everything, the myths, the shadows, the politics, what's the real truth about ninjas? It's not the version movies show you, and it's definitely not the superhuman fantasy that anime made global. The truth is far more uncomfortable, and far more revealing about Japan itself. Ninjas existed because Japan needed them, even when its culture pretended it didn't. Samurai lived by honor. Ninjas lived by results. Samurai fought in the open. Ninjas fought in the spaces nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. Samurai represented ideals. Ninjas represented reality. And that's why their story is so powerful. It exposes a contradiction inside every society, the difference between what a nation claims to value and what it actually relies on behind closed doors. Historically, ninjas weren't legends. They were tools of survival, politics, intelligence, and war. They were the quiet hands behind major events, the spies who shaped decisions, the informants who tipped the balance of power, the unseen force influencing battles without ever drawing a sword. But when Japan modernized, those shadows became inconvenient, too real, too messy,
too inglamoureux.
So the country did something brilliant. It didn't erase ninjas. It rewrote them. It turned them into symbols instead of survivors, into myths instead of people, into entertainment instead of evidence. And ironically, that made them immortal. The real ninjas, the ones who hid in forests, disguised themselves as monks, sabotaged armies, survived ambushes, and endured everything society threw at them. They didn't get statues or scrolls celebrating them. But they got something bigger, a legend the whole world remembers, even when the truth remains buried in the dark. When you strip away the myths, Japan's forbidden ninjas weren't superheroes. They were survivors shaped by shadows, politics, and a world that needed them but never dared to acknowledge them. Their real story is darker, rawer, and far more human than legend ever admits. If you want more hidden histories, secret worlds, and truths buried in the dark, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us, because the shadows always have more to reveal.